Long ago, when the whole country was covered with thick forest, a man ordered the felling of 7 great oak trees. And they were felled and they were formed into a wide round table. And there he sat all the knights of his realm, so that no man sat higher than the next. And in this way he brought peace and unity. Well, Arthur was not a great one for baking. So although Christmas was coming, he was out in the forest. He loved to gallop after the stag. But that day, the dusk was falling. He'd lost the stag, he'd lost all his men, and he looked down to see his beloved hound was limping. And so he threw himself down from his horse to check the hound's paw. And it was then he felt the cold of steel on the back of his neck. And he found himself looking up at the largest man he had ever seen. His limbs were the size of mighty tree trunks, and there where his hair should have been, there was a tangled knot of twigs and leaves. "Arthur," said the large man, "Arthur, bringer of peace. Arthur, cutter down of 7 great oak trees. Oh, they must have been so happy, so honoured to have been cut down by Arthur himself. But you forgot, didn't you? You forgot to invite the rest of the world. You forgot to invite us, the creatures of the forest. You forgot to invite the creatures of the air. And what about the sea, eh?" Arthur felt the dagger of the knight stabbing into his doublet. And the knight continued, "Yes, I should like to reach in and pull out your beating heart here and now. But thanks to your law of chivalry, I may not do this. Arthur, you have 1 year. 1 year to answer my riddle, and if you don't do it, then you are mine." The stars were twinkling in the night sky when the gates of Camelot opened that night, and the horse of Arthur walked in wearily, and Arthur himself stumbled up the steps, and who should be waiting for him on the steps but his nephew Gawain. Gawain, the purest, the youngest, the most beautiful knight of all those that sat around the table. And Gawain said, "Uncle, what's happened? Where have you been?" Beside the crackling fire, Arthur told him. And Gawain said at once, "Uncle, you are a king. Tomorrow I will go out and I will search far and wide for the answer to this riddle. For there must be one, Uncle, in all those who live in our great realm, who knows the answer." They tried to stop him, but to no avail. With the smells of Christmas in his nostrils, Gawain saddled his horse and set off into the winter. And Gawain, he travelled from castle to cottage, from cottage to house, from house to hut, and he was cold, and he was often hungry, and he was often alone. But never did he stop asking the question of everyone he met, "Please tell me, if you can, the answer to this riddle. What is it that great Mother Nature desires above all else?" A fine lord answered him, "Gawain, it's quite simple. Mother Nature desires above all else to serve us human beings. It is this which brings her happiness and comfort." The next to answer was a blacksmith. He said, "Gawain, you see, what Mother Nature desires is order, everything in its right place." But next stop in the tavern, there was a man who said, "Gawain, Mother Nature is just like all other women, isn't it? What she desires most of all is hot, amorous, glorious, you know what I mean. And when she's got that, well, then she gets all the progeny, doesn't she? She gets all the kids. Oh yeah, she's just like the rest of them, Gawain. You don't worry." Well, as the winter turned into spring and the spring into summer, and Gawain noted down on his great parchment more and more answers. He became more and more confused. And soon, before he knew what had happened, he was trotting down the frosty road back into Camelot, and his heart was filled with despair. He did not know the answer to the riddle. There beside the road, he saw a figure, huddled, covered with a red cloak. More out of habit than hope, he dropped from his horse and said, "Please tell me if you know the answer to this riddle. What is it that great Mother Nature desires above all else?" And suddenly he found himself looking deep into the ugliest face he had ever seen. Her skin was like a battleground where mountainous pustules ran down into rivers of snot. Her eyes staring wildly, the one down to his leg, the other viewing the skies. Her nose was twisted, her mouth set in a huge beard of bristles, and two enormous teeth, more like the teeth of hogs than of a human being.
"I can tell you the answer to that," she said. "But what will I get as a reward?"
"Old Mother, you may have whatever it is in my power or the king's power to grant you if you can tell me the true answer to this riddle." Well, a week later, Arthur was galloping into the forest, and before he had gone very far, there was the huge knight waiting for him. And Arthur dropped from his horse and said, "I have an answer for you. Let us see if it is true or not. What great nature desires above all else is to have the freedom to choose herself where her forests will grow, where her tiny birds will nest, where the fish shall swim in the deeps." "Curses," said the huge knight. "Curses! That must have been my sister who told you the answer to that riddle. Never in 1,000 years would you have found it yourself, Arthur. Very well, it is our loss." And so there was a great feast that Christmas. I wish you could have been there. I wish you could have tasted from the huge barrels of beer, tasted from the roasted hogs, all the sweetmeats that Christmas could offer. And there in the midst was Gawain, and around him a huge bevy of beautiful women saying to him, "Gawain, tell us again the story of your bravery. Oh, Gawain." He felt a tapping on his shoulder, and there was a servant saying, "Sir, there is a hideous-looking woman who says you would like to meet her outside the door." "Yes, indeed." So Gawain went out, and there she was, looking, if possible, even more horrible than she had the day before. Gawain fell down on his knees and said, "Dear, dear old mother, how can we ever thank you enough? Please tell us, whatever it is within my power or the king's to give, it's yours." And the old woman looked down at him and said,
"Gawain, what I'd really like is if you stop calling me old mother and called me dear wife."
"Yes. Yes," said Gawain, of course. What could be more simple?" And so, before he had time to think about it more deeply, he took the old hag into the chapel, and there they were wed. "Gawain," called the king, "who is this stranger you bring into our feast today?" "That's no stranger, your majesty," said Gawain. "Please allow me to present my wife." A silence fell in the hall. The sound of women's sobs could be heard, muffled all around the room, and the men were staring down, sickened onto their food, couldn't bear to put a single morsel into their mouth or drink a drop. The only one who was eating was the hag. With her huge teeth, she tore into the roasted meats and swilled down the beer. As soon as he politely could, he led her away, led her into the bridal chamber. Fresh sheets had been laid on the bed. The fire was burning in the hearth. It smelt sweet there in that room, but Gawain threw off his clothes, put on his nightshirt and jumped into bed, pretending to be asleep. She blew out the light, and then he heard a pitiful voice saying,
"Gawain, is it not usual for a husband to kiss his new wife?"
"Yes, of course," said Gawain. "How silly of me. I must have forgot." And gathering all the courage he could find in his heart and trying desperately not to think about the great tusks and the bristly chin, he turned over in the darkness. But there, as he took her in his arms, her bony back seemed to melt and become soft. And that great bristly mouth felt more like silk. For some time, he was quite lost in the embrace. And then he drew himself away and struck a light and turned to her. "Well, who are you?" he said. "Are you an angel who has come into my bed?" "Oh, no," she said. "This is me, Gawain. You have broken the spell. Only one who wed me of his own free will could do this. But I can only be myself for half the day. I can only be fair by day and foul by night, or fair by night and foul by day. What would you have me be?" Well, this was a very difficult question. Gawain would have her fair as she was now in his bed each night, but then she would have to be disgusting, that hideous hag, by day, people spitting on her and hating the very sight of her. But then if she was fair by day, he would have to spend each night with that hideous hag. Suddenly, he understood. "But of course," he said, "it's not me that's going to have to live like this. It's you who should choose." "Gawain," she said, "now the spell is truly broken. You have given me that which great Mother Nature herself desires, the freedom to choose." And so once again they fell into each other's arms, and there we must leave them. But next day, when the sun had climbed high into the sky, Arthur could wait no longer. He said, "That hideous hag has eaten my nephew." And he had the door broken down and burst in upon them, still in deep embrace. And Gawain turned to the king and said, "Uncle, that riddle is true."